2020 Democratic presidential hopefuls spent Martin Luther King Day crisscrossing the country with events focused on race issues. Several candidates were in South Carolina for the annual King Day at the Dome event. Then they took off for Iowa to participate in the Brown and Black Presidential Forum. Here is some of what they had to say.
I think the Democratic Party is diminished when we only have white people on the stage.
But when you meet someone through the prism of being a presidential candidate, especially a new on the scene, young, white presidential candidate, talking about big ideas, rolling out something like the Douglas Plan, saying, trust me, you see just how much frustration and pain is beneath the skepticism that a lot of people have.
Entrepreneurship is not going to do the trick. It's not going to create enough opportunities in black and brown communities. The only way we're going to make opportunities flourish in these black and brown communities is by putting money into people's hands. That's why I'm running for president.
So let's bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. He is in Des Moines, Iowa at a Sanders event. So welcome, Ed. What message are we hearing from candidates at the Brown and Black Forum, and how valuable is this event for the candidates?
Hey, Tanya, good to see you. Happy MLK Day. A message not necessarily different than what they talk about on a regular basis when it comes to economic empowerment for minorities, their stance on immigration and how it differs entirely from what President Trump is up to, and other issues of concern that have been raised by folks in the crowd. Perhaps the bigger deal is that they're here at all. The Brown and Black Forum is held every 4 years just before the Iowa caucus, and it's designed to bring civil rights organizations and minority groups here in a state that is predominantly white together to try to get the candidates to talk about issues of concern to minorities ahead of a caucus, again, in a predominantly white state. They held it this year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which compelled virtually the entire Democratic field to be here and to answer their questions. And whether it's here or across the country, Joe Biden, of course, has a huge advantage among African Americans. He has some competition among Latinos with Bernie Sanders. Ultimately, they're not going to be a huge percentage of the turnout here in Iowa, but in close contests like this one, in a state like this, they can have an oversized role in picking the ultimate winner.
Absolutely. And Ed, one candidate who we just saw speaking there who has faced questions over his record on race is former South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I mean, he has a limited record as it is. He's only been a mayor, but he's had, not a stellar report on how he dealt with race relations in his own town. So how is he addressing that now? This is clearly, a weakness for his campaign. How is he addressing that?
Yeah, it's a perceived weakness, certainly, that his campaign has worked hard to fix, and they scrambled his schedule today so that he could be in South Carolina and Iowa, like most of the candidates. He was a late addition to the events in South Carolina. Faced questions again today about his interactions with black police officers and the former black police chief in South Bend. That's a complicated story, but he essentially defended his record, saying at the time he had no choice, and that he is working to obviously reach out to black voters, and is still convinced that as they get to know him, they will support him. Of course, there was some troubling evidence for that argument in a recent Washington Post national survey of African-American voters that found that among African-American voters, he had about 2% support. Among African-American voters who knew about him, he had just 3% support. So he clearly has a lot of work to do. But he also made the point today that Democrats and Republicans have probably taken too much advantage of minority communities in the past and need to work to build trust and win back their support. It's an uphill climb for him for sure, but some certainly would give him credit for showing up and at least facing the music.
And Ed, I want to get your take on the New York Times editorial board endorsing both Senators Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren for president, sort of outlining that they are both representing two distinct streams of the Democratic Party right now, and an argument could be made for both of them. I also want to note that there were some places, including the Washington Post, that sort of parodied this op-ed. But so tell us what you think, Ed. Talk to us about this debate that the debate over the choice that Democratic voters will have to make between the more progressive or the more moderate groups.
Yeah, I've never met a voter who's made their decision based on what the New York Times or any other newspaper really has decided or who they've endorsed. Certainly an out-of-state paper Maybe we'll hear that there were people who voted for Amy Klobuchar because she was endorsed over the weekend by the Quad City Times, or maybe there'll be voters who go with whoever the Des Moines Register selects. But we haven't heard of somebody picking their ultimate candidate because the New York Times backed them. They're having the same conflict that Democrats everywhere are. Do you go with your head? Do you go with your heart? Do you go with someone who's more progressive or someone who's more pragmatic? And it is a serious conflict causing great anxiety for voters, not only here but across the country. And it's part of the fight that they'll continue to have up until February 3rd and beyond. You have plenty of good, solid options, the voters tell us, on both sides of that debate. And, you know, Klobuchar and Warren would point out that at this point they've helped clear the field of experienced governors, of other former cabinet secretaries, other members of Congress, and they remain in the fight. I think the Klobuchar camp especially was surprised by that endorsement. But again, you find me 1, 2, or 3 people who've been influenced by the New York Times, and I'll buy them dinner, because I just don't necessarily think that that endorsement carries much weight outside of New York newsrooms.
All right, Ed, so opening arguments, as you know, are set to begin in the Senate's impeachment trial of President Trump Tuesday. Senators Klobuchar and Warren, as well as Senators Sanders and Michael Bennet, will all be in Washington and not on the campaign trail. How do those senators in the top tier plan to keep up their campaign's momentum during the trial?
2 words: private jets. They have plans, or they're working on plans, to get here and to get to New Hampshire quickly, either after a trial ends on certain days or on the breaks, Sundays mostly. Just today, as we were getting here ourselves, we saw another private jet landing with one of them on board. We weren't quite sure who, as they shuttled from South Carolina here to Iowa in time for the event. We know that Sanders, for example, is planning to hold a rally Wednesday night in northeastern Iowa in Cedar Falls. He's banking on the presumption that the trial will recess at some point Wednesday afternoon or early evening, allowing him to take that 1,700-mile flight and then go back to Washington in the same evening. Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar are considering similar plans, but they're also deploying their husbands, their children, and their top surrogates. And Sanders will be doing the same, believing that those folks can help make the case in the closing days of this campaign. And it'll be an incredible test of whether FaceTime and actually seeing a candidate in person matters, or if these candidates have already done enough to bank away support and goodwill and hold on to votes despite their absence.
I guess they're not worried about the optics of flying in private jets then, Ed.
Apparently not, because at this point I think they would concede it's really the only thing they can do.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much.